So this is the second part of this podcast, monthly podcast of Homo Ludens, where we'll talk about our wargame club. But I'm going to leave Luis to explain a bit what's the concept behind this club.
Hey, hi everyone. This is Luis here. So the Club de Jeu is a monthly gaming extravaganza where we get together and we choose one game that we want to dedicate an entire month to learn the rules, talk about, discuss the history, and just overall just get nitty gritty with the mechanics. This month's game is Warriors of God, an MMP release, hectic and lots of fun.
Yeah, so it's designed by Makoto Nakajima. So it's part of the International Game Series from MMP. It's a collection that is dedicated to foreign design that were translated in English. A couple of notable games from those series are, for example, Storm over Stalingrad or A Victory Lost. Also, both Japanese design with a lot of interesting approaches to classical wargaming systems. They are usually more on the medium side, so not too heavy, but very subtle. In that regard, I thought that's already one thing interesting with Warriors of God is that it's a bit more Ameritrashy, but we'll talk about it a bit more. Anyway, the idea of this segment is to have a few people from the Discord server that dedicated their months playing this game to do a bit of a collective review of the game, discuss it, what we liked, what we didn't like, and explore the history behind it, and then hopefully at the end have a short wrap up where we all say basically what's our review of the game. And with me tonight, I have Louis, that we just heard, our benevolent dictator of Le Club de Jeu. Then we have Pierre, Stuart, and Deborah. Thanks all for being here tonight. But, and I just warned Stuart, like literally 2 minutes before recording, I asked Stuart, and he has a responsibility of doing it because he has a PhD in history, so he has no excuse. Maybe just to contextualize the game, it's a game about the 100 Years' War. So before we start talking about the game, can you give us, like I would be generous, in 2 minutes, an overview of what's the 100 Years' War?
I will do my best to keep time. So fundamentally, the 100 Years' War is a label that we use to describe what is actually 116 years of Anglo-French conflict within a broader Anglo-French period, a period of Anglo-French conflict. So it's really something we've carved out in modern history, and it marks a specific sort of period in this kind of intermittent warfare between the two kingdoms. And it really starts with Philip IV of King of France dies, and then all of his sons die without heir. And you end up with this dispute where his daughter had married the King of England, and their child was Edward III, King of England. And then it passed to his cousin to become King of France. At the time, Edward III was a minor and the rule was being done by his mother and her lover, who had deposed his father. Great time in English history. And so the kind of the core of the war comes when Edward III comes of age and decides that he wants to claim the right to be the King of France. And so you have this dispute where the English monarchs claim that they have the rightful claim to be kings of France, and the kings of France, obviously, who are the Valois dynasty, claim that they are the proper kings of France. And this conflict ensues. And you can split it into many phases, but we tend to split it into two phases. There's sort of the Edwardian phase, which follows Edward III and his initial wars with his triumphs at Crécy, and then most notably at Poitiers, where he captures King Jean II of France, who is Jean le Bon, which I love. It's great alliteration in a name. And that results in the Treaty of Brittany, where basically it kind of seems like it's going to end the war. Edward III gives up his claim to be King of France in exchange for huge amounts of French lands. He basically gets back all of the holdings that have been held by Richard I and his family up until King John lost them all. And that seemed like it was resolved, and then it isn't resolved, and there's some fighting in between that we mostly ignore in English historiography because it doesn't go great for the English. And then with the deposing of King Richard II, who's Edward III's grandson, by his other grandson, Henry IV, and we get a resumption of the war, and eventually Henry V, who's of course the most famous protagonist of this war in English, reinvades France, makes another claim to the French monarchy. In the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, he's made heir to the French throne and then dies before the French king dies. And then at the end of the war, we have Charles VII, who's the son of the mad Charles VI, takes, with the help of Joan of Arc initially, and then on his own, retakes all of France from England except for the Pale of Calais. So it's this kind of push-pull where we have a lot of English victories and an ultimate defeat in the end. And really, I mean, the war kind of keeps going afterwards, but no one really cares about it because the War of the Roses starts and England falls into chaos.
Okay, so in the end, justice prevailed. That's that's good. But thanks for that. I think it's an awesome overview of it. Thank you. And for something that you had to improvise on the spot, I must say I'm super impressed. Now I feel bad, but I think it was good. Already one thing interesting is that we can see how rich and complex and long the history of the 100 Years' War is, and it's going to be interesting to further down the line in this discussion address how good the game is at covering such a long period of time. So that's going to be interesting. But before we start, the thing that I like to ask is to each of you, how many games did you manage to have over the months, and were they solo, mostly online with different people? And I'm going to start with you, Louis.
Yeah, so I had about 5 games. So 2 solo, one of each scenario, and then 3 games in person.
Okay, so that's a pretty good, I don't know, schedule, I would say. And you, Deborah?
I played it a couple of times solo, and then for about 10 minutes trying to show a friend to see whether they would like to join in, and the answer was no.
Why did they say no?
Well, I thought they probably would. They're not really wargamers, and it was a bit too complicated for them, and the dice chucking was off-putting.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. And you, Stuart?
I played 3. I played 2 solo. I played one of each scenario. You probably mentioned that there's a second scenario in the game that covers an earlier phase of, it's like Richard I and Philip II of France, and Robin Hood, most importantly. So I played, one of each solo, and then, as you know, Fred, we played, I don't know if we can call it a game, but
Oh, come on. Oh, stop it.
We played the game in a triumphant English victory by...
it was brutal.
1400.
It was brutal. Yeah, it was an awful experience. So my first king of France stayed and died in prison of his old age. Like, he kept being there and giving you 3 victory points each turn, and he didn't want to die. It was really annoying.
You really like the Tower of London. The cuisine is stellar.
Yeah, so I've heard. And you, Pierre?
I played 5 games, 2 solo in person, and then 3 on Vassal.
Okay, so that's also a pretty good, pretty good score. So that's quite nice. So you all had enough time with the game. I would ask something maybe to you specifically, Deborah, because you only played solo. Did you feel like the game was like good enough to play solo, or were you a bit frustrated not to have an opponent?
At first I was frustrated, not because it would have been exciting to have someone with me, and the game is quite exciting when you start, but by the end I thought, actually this is a game I'd prefer to play solo, because the swings of luck are so much that, if your opponent keeps getting bad rolls and you're doing really well, actually I kind of enjoy that less. Whereas on your own, at least you're just having to cope with misfortune, it's fine.
Yeah, that's true. That's a really good point, and that's one of the points that I would like to address about the game. It's swinginess. But before going there, and thanks to Stuart overview of the history of the 100 Years' War, I was curious to hear your thoughts about how well you think it represented the history, and maybe we can start with you, Pierre.
Sure, yeah. So I think it represented the history well in the way that it's messy, like it feels very swingy, it feels very crazy. Like I studied the 100 Years' War German Masters. I know that it's not accurate strictly, but it did feel sort of like it was quite swingy, nice. It told a story really well. I agree with Deborah in her sort of in that, like, playing it solo is quite nice because one side is inevitably going to do terribly with a string of bad luck, and it tells that story really well. But it might feel a bit nah when it happens to you. So I think it represents what it's trying to do quite well. You know.
Yeah. And what were your thoughts, Luis?
Yeah, for me, I'm in the same side with Peter. There's a few things though that I would want to add to it, which is one is that it doesn't really simulate the conflict itself very well, but it's a very good simulation though of, I guess, the time period and what one can expect from it, right? When it comes to life expectancy, etc., and just like the logistical elements of medieval warfare. Um, so you have these situations where you distribute troops all around the board, and then you assign leaders to them. Well, you do that, and then you get a roll, and like the leader dies, and you're like, well, I just moved how many of these like people here, and it's like everything's done, it's over. Eh, yeah,
Yeah,
that's
and maybe
hilarious. Like it's just too funny. Like I just that's the thing with the swinginess to me. It's like, yeah, it can be frustrating if you definitely take this very seriously, but if you get to a point where it's just so it's just so insane. It's like so much pandemonium that I can't take it seriously. Like it's just like, wow. So I just lost 5 of my 7 like royals. So it's like I have 2 people that can manage like all these people. It's over. Like it's done for me.
And Deborah, how did you feel about how the way it depicted the history of the Hundred Years' War?
I was a little bit more negative, actually. I felt its historical portrayal was really quite empty and thin. In particular, you don't get any of the economics, you don't get any of the peasant revolts, you don't get anything, in fact, apart from leaders dying all the time. And this really fits in with a sort of great man school of history. I mean, the game teaches you that having a good leader is really vital. And what your most precious asset, and a single noble is equal in battle to a whole body of troops, and their bravery can double the hit rate of your army. I mean, it's none of that is realistic, it seems to me. And the fact that there are 2 scenarios for different kind of periods just shows that it's not really related to the history at all. I think you can say, well, the focus on leaders is in some ways important because we are talking about a squabble between the heirs, of group of interrelated, largely francophone landlords. That's basically what it is. And you can say, okay, well, that is all about leaders. But the game actually presents it always constantly as being a war between England and France. And I think that's kind of questionable and undercuts the argument for saying that it should be about just the Lords.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you're saying because when playing, I was reading a bit about the Hundred Years' War, thanks to some recommendation from Stuart, and I felt a bit the same way. Like I thought it was funny, that's
Yes.
for sure, and that's something that we'll go back into. I think the game is extremely funny, even in the rules there are some really funny bits. I think it also makes fun of those great people. Maybe like there is this great man depiction of history that's true, but at the same time they are made fun of, which is quite interesting. Like you can have a king that can muster and move troops all across the country, like tons of them, but when he fights he's really really bad, and I think that was a interesting element, but I was also a bit frustrated by some missing elements, like as you say, like for example, les jacqueries, like peasant revolts in France was something really big, and it's absolutely not represented. You have some leaders that are naturally on one side or another, and maybe it's not that clear in the history that it was natural that would fall under the French side or the British side. And yeah, and the other thing that I felt was missing is the geopolitical aspect, that when you read about it, you realize that there was actually what the neighbors were doing around was quite significant, and you have almost no agency around this, or it's almost not represented. You do have the King of Navarre, but it's just a random guy that can go to one side or another. Definitely, it's a very weird perspective on it. What were your thoughts on it, Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, as a model of the Hundred Years' War, it's not very good. But I think it does do a good job at leaning into very few specific parts. Like I like the random leader death kind of representing that a lot of these people did die young. And I think there is kind of, if you're making a game of 100 Years' War, you kind of have two approaches, right? Like, do you script the deaths? Do you say, like, well, Edward III will always outlive the Black Prince and Henry V will always die young? Or do you do what Warriors of God does and say it's going to be completely random and anyone can die whenever? And I like that about it. I think that is a very good capturing of that kind of unknowable length of life that a warlord or general would have at this time. I also think I like its captured and ransoming rules. The fact that that's such a big part of the game is the capturing of lords, and then you just like leave them to rot and hope they'll die because ransoms are so expensive. But if you do that, it costs you victory points. Like, I think that captures that, but it is very much a nobility focused depiction of the war. And I think it tries to do a little bit of that geopolitical with the neutral lords that can go either way. But as you say, like, the King of Navarre is just some guy. It is actually a thing I think works a little bit better in the other scenario than a 100 Years' War scenario, where the lords that can switch sides are actually much more powerful. Like Richard I can be French, which is great, which I think is an interesting choice there. But yeah, for the 100 Years' War, it's not really like a very realistic. I think it's very tongue in cheek, and it would almost be better if it had like cartoony illustrations, like if we had 100 Years' War asterisk and obelisk or something on it. You know, like, it feels like a very irreverent version of the conflict, and I think if we leaned into that artistically, it might have been a bit more fun.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, it's almost it's almost like a funny game or something like this. And then again, to Deborah was saying something super interesting around the economical aspect of the 100 Years' War not being depicted. Did you feel like that you missed that also, Stuart?
I don't know if I missed it I mean, like, it is definitely a thing that is missing from the game, and particularly you don't see like the very different ways the economies function. I mean, England had a much more militarized economy, basically, with a more structured parliament and tax system that then you see France replicate or do their own version of at the end of the war, and is key to them winning in the end. So you don't really have that development where England starts out much more militarized, and France has a much harder time. The King of France, anyway, has a much harder time mobilizing his troops. At the same time, though, I think my kind of one of my complaints about Warriors of God, which a game I do really like, is that it is probably slightly too long for what it is, and I don't know if adding more to it would help with that. You know, like, I don't know if I would enjoy this game specifically more with a more economic focus,
Yeah, I
but
agree.
I am
agree.
sad that this is like one of the only 100 Years' War games.
Yeah,
you know, like, there's so much more to explore here that this game doesn't do.
And then maybe we can start talking about the mechanics. And I would like to go back to you, Deborah, because you mentioned this a couple of times already in both your interventions, and that's the randomness of the game. So there is the random leader death, then there is the elimination chart for when a leader loses a battle, and then there is the combat itself. How did you feel about the use of randomness in the game?
I did, by the end, become very bored with throwing dice, I have to say. I mean, I think the game is a bit too long from my point of view for that reason, because it is simply, one dice throw after another. Again, though, on my own, if I was playing this as a solo game, I don't mind randomness. It's something that it's a sort of exciting part of the game, and it allows you to find strategies. There are things that you can do to mitigate it to some extent and so on. But playing with someone else, it does bother me. I'm always feeling sorry for them and things. I'd rather have victories that are completely my own,
I could hear you react, Pierre. Did you feel the same way?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. I completely agree with the whole, you'd rather have victories that are totally your own. But I'd say that that's not what the game's trying to do, And I think I felt that way a lot in the first scenario I did, especially because I did the Lion of Winter scenario, so like the Anarchy and then going on later. And that one went until the end. It went until all 12 turns. And at the end, it was just sort of, it was pretty grating at the end. But the second playthrough, the second solo playthrough of the 100 Years War scenario, I think we're going to go back to this a lot, but it ended up being funny and just, yeah.
And you, Louis, what was your feeling about the randomness of the combat, randomness of the leader death, and the elimination table?
Yeah, I can see where the frustration comes with that, but for me, mainly, it's a lot of that is. I mean, yeah, because of the length, I think it becomes a negative. Like, if the game overall was shorter, the randomness maybe wouldn't be that big of a deal. But I tend to like it. I like chugging dice. Yeah, I don't really have that much negative to say necessarily about the luck. Only when you look at it in tandem with the length of it. If it goes more than 8+ rounds, then yeah, then that it gets to be a problem.
Yeah, and that's the thing. To Deborah's point is like when you have big battles, and for me it happened really. So I played just this Wednesday a game that went better. Stuart, I was so actually the French were winning, but we didn't go to the end. Like it was a bit too long, and we were playing at the Cardboard Emperors Club, and I had to go back home. So we actually managed to only play the seven turns, and it took us, I don't know, something like almost 2 hours and a half or something like this. So I think going through the whole game would have lasted for maybe 4 hours. And we had a few big battles, and I think both of us, we had fun for a lot of the game, like seeing the randomness, but just resolving those long battles were quite dull. Actually, I was a bit, and it felt like you actually had limited also control over how you can control that randomness. I mean, the leader
That's
is
true.
is
That's
what it
true.
is, and you cannot really change anything about it, and you feel like you don't really have control, any form of agency, and it's a bit kind of frustrating. What did you think, Stuart?
Yeah, I definitely think the battles are too long. I mean, this was not a problem I had in my first game, because in my first game, literally every king died the first turn they showed up until Charles VI, who shows up halfway through the war. So I never had a commander who could command more than like two guys. So the battles were really, really small. So at that scale, it was fine, where you only ever had a couple rounds and then you moved on. But I think it would benefit a lot if battles, honestly, like I think the randomness doesn't bother as much as the length. If battles were as random but one round,
Yeah,
I think I would enjoy it more. If you just rolled once, saw who won, and moved on, I think it would benefit. And if it moved along at a better pace, it would also really benefit from a short game scenario. Something that starts halfway through, because you don't really get to that end game very often. I don't think none of my
Yeah.
games lasted really past like 14-10. So I think it's something that's kind of missing from that.
it's interesting. I would have liked actually a Joan of Arc scenario.
Mm.
That would have been really fun. I think. I don't.
It does feel weird that she's on the front
Yeah,
of the game box, and I think most games people will have she'll never turn up.
Yeah, it really feels like there should be a scenario where you just start at like Henry IV and you just play through and you get Joan of Arc in like turn 3 and it probably wouldn't be that hard to make one either. I bet
No,
someone's
yeah.
done one because you just need a deployment and then play the game as it is. Like,
yeah. Maybe there is someone who did it on BGG, and if not, it's probably easy to propose a scenario for that. But maybe for context for the people listening that haven't played, so the game is supposed to be on the Hundred Years' War, and the core scenario is about that. But then there are actually two scenarios in the box. So you have the Hundred Years' War, and then you have the Lion in Winter scenario. And I would like to ask each of you: did you play the Lion in Winter scenario? Maybe starting with you, Deborah.
Yes, I did, and I did it because it had Robin Hood.
Yeah.
But I was quite annoyed actually because Robin Hood is an outlaw. He's not a loyal grunt of the
Yeah.
Plantagenets. So,
Yeah.
so I was a bit frustrated about that.
And that's the reason why I didn't want to play it. For me, having Robin Hood as a noble is something that I cannot respect. I am not happy with that.
I liked Eleanor of Aquitaine being quite a strong early ruler. That was one of the sort of French or English ones. I thought it was quite nice to have a really one with like a 1/8 that could be flipped.
So Deborah and Pierre, you've played it. Louis, did you also play the Lion in Winter scenario?
Yes, I played that scenario, and um, that one I think tends to be the one that runs the least amount of time for me. So usually like 7 or 8 turns, and it's done for me. Depending on the swinginess of the leader deaths, I think it's good. The Robin Hood stuff. Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with Fred there, but I don't know. I didn't really take that too. I don't know. I mean, I guess for me, I don't really see this game as much as a good simulation of the war of the time period, and I'm fine with that. Like, it's fun to play a game like that's supposed to be a war game that's just this silly. Like, I don't really know that many war games that are this silly.
And you, Stuart, you played both also, right?
Yeah, I played both. One of the things I really liked about Lion in Winter was that there were a lot more, as you mentioned, Eleanor of Aquitaine is quite a strong leader and is neutral, so she can be either side. And then Richard the First as well. I mean, he's a very strong leader, one of the best I've seen in either of the scenarios, and he can be either side as well. So it has that, which I think is kind of good because the neutral leaders are taken by whoever didn't have the initiative that round. So in the 100 Years' War, it can be a bit boring because sometimes you're just picking from two kind of meh leaders, versus in Lion in Winter, it felt much more like there were really good commanders on available, so you didn't get as many activations that turn. You had to play second, but then at the end of it, you're rewarded with quite a good leader, and then hopefully they don't die immediately. I do think they should have taken a stand of bravery, though, and put Robin Hood in both scenarios, because there's this whole thing where a bunch of the medieval versions of Robin Hood kind of imply that he's around during the reigns of King Edward, and it could be Edward III. So, I mean, just like stick him in both, multi-use counter, it's more efficient.
But and going back to you, Deborah, did you feel like this second scenario brought something different to the game, apart from you being annoyed by Robin Hood being in there, or did it do mostly more of the same with just different leader and maybe some more interesting decisions for the neutral ones?
I felt it was really essentially the same. And I was a little bit disappointed because I'd hoped that there would be a difference, but no, it's just leaders dying all over again. It's just very much the same thing. So.
And now I have a very specific question, and this one is for Stuart specifically. Longbows, overpowered or not overpowered?
I mean, I think the problem is that there aren't also crossbows. That really hurts me. I mean, I can only give it a 4 out of 10. There's no crossbows. But I don't think they're that overpowered in the game, just because they give you more dice, but you generally need 6s to hit, so it often doesn't make a huge difference. Like, it doesn't feel like the English are consistently winning all their battles, and in amongst the kind of greater randomness of the conflict. They are amazing when Robin Hood uses them, though. Oh my god. He has a whole special rule that makes them... That may be a bit overpowered.
Yeah, maybe he really had a thing for Robin Hood. That's quite interesting. And there is no actually historical note in the game. There are just comments on the play notes in the rules. Was that something that maybe were you frustrated about the fact that there were no historical notes? Maybe starting with you, Louis.
It's a good point. I guess just to add something to this, I know that the person that did a lot of the redesign for MMP, Adam, I forget his last name. I know that there's been some controversy in the way that he's handled some of these releases for MMP, either changing specific rules altogether and adding things to the rule book that weren't necessarily there, and taking things out.
So you're talking about Adam Starkweather,
Yes, Adam Starkweather. And I don't really know if that's a matter if having no historical notes was something that Adam did, or it's just from the very beginning Warriors of God have. I would have liked um, some historical notes. I think for games like this, it definitely helps, right? It helps you get into the conflict, right? And it helps set the mood for what to expect. Just so let's see, maybe certain gameplay mechanics that might be tailored to specific things that actually happened. You have a better understanding of this if you have historical notes. Now, if like for me, I'm a complete novice when it comes to the history of the conflict and the period. So, having something like that would have definitely increased my enjoyment of it.
Yeah, and it's true that because it's so high level, and it has a few hints here and there, like a few good jokes, but like if you don't have the context, I agree with you, Louis, that it can be hard to get. And I know that for me, my enjoyment of the game highly improved when I started reading about it. So, but around that the lack of historical note, did you have any thoughts about it, Deborah?
I wasn't so bothered about it. I mean, to be fair, I did a history degree, so I did know quite a bit about the war, but I also felt that because I think the game is quite unhistorical, I'm not sure that notes would have helped get over that bridge at all, really. I mean, it would have been quite jarring, the distinction between the historical notes and the lack of history in the game.
And do you feel that maybe there is something there, the fact that it's very unhistorical and that there is no historical note, that maybe the Did you feel like maybe the research was a bit light on the design side before making the design?
Yes, I do. And one of the things I would say about the I mean, it's very funny, I agree, but the general impression it gives of this period is that people died every 2 minutes, which is a little is a little unjust, and it's sort of part of anti-medieval prejudice, which also calling it warriors of God. Why warriors of God? They weren't
Yeah.
fighting a religious battle, but it's all to do with the sort of stereotype of the Middle Ages, which seems to be the level the history is on.
The Warriors God thing is very weird. It really screams Crusades game.
Yeah. It was really weird when I actually bought it and opened it. I was like, "What? Where's the Crusade scenario? What is?"
I suppose Joan of Arc is really into the idea of a godly war, but and I have her, she's on the cover, but then she's barely in the game. So
Yeah, that's something actually that kept me from getting into the game initially, was because I'm like, oh, this is some like crazy, like uber religious, like game. And then it's like, oh, wait, it's actually not.
Yeah, I don't really understand where the name comes from. I was also a bit confused.
Is it maybe I don't know this. Is it maybe a Shakespeare quote? Because all of the history they have in the rule book and on the counters at the back of the knight counters and the longbow one are all Shakespeare quotes. So I don't know. It might come from that, but
Yeah, I'm not really sure. But yeah, I think it's quite interesting. But yeah, I don't know absolutely. I don't know anything about the design process from Mr. Nakajima. But I think it's a really fair point from Deborah. It's very thin. But yeah, and for you, Stuart, did you feel like you missed something that you would have liked to have at least some reflection from the designer about how they approached history in the game? Just to
yeah,
understand.
I would have been really interested in something from the Japanese designer. Like I'm a terrible wargamer. I don't really read historical notes, but I don't think I would have particularly cared if MMP had added them like to their version. I'm not very interested in like who the people who work at MMP's version of the Hundred Years' War, but I would be really interested in, a Japanese wargamer's conception of what the Hundred Years' War is like. And particularly because, Japan has this really interesting fascination with Joan of Arc. She shows up in loads of like Japanese strategy video games and stuff. And there's this whole, so I'm like really kind of curious about that. And I would really enjoy it. But I think that mostly from an intellectual standpoint, I don't think it would have really featured into my experience of the game. I'm just generally interested in like how these conflicts are perceived from the other side of the world.
And I think that's a hard question, and that's okay if neither of you, Deborah and Stuart, can answer. But do you feel like maybe the game is the reflection of like historiography in Japan? The fact that do they have a weird perception of the 100 Years' War, or is it just a light, stupid game? What do you think, Deborah?
Well, I really have no idea what the perception of is in Japan, but I would say that it sort of fits with the general impression of the Middle Ages that people have, so seem to have anyway. So maybe in Japan too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose. The previous game by the designer is Warriors of Japan, which is uses some of the same mechanics. I haven't played it, but like similar ideas in Japan, and it does feel a bit like with the various commanders and stuff, feel like they map much better onto Japanese daimyo and kind of Sengoku Jidai era warfare. So it does feel a bit like it's adapting that system to a different conflict, and it obviously has its own elements. Like the death table isn't in Warriors of Japan; it doesn't cover that same long period, but yeah, it definitely feels like it's definitely coming out of historiography that I don't know very well. And I think that is interesting. I do really wish there were more 100 Years War games that it could be compared against, because it's one of the only ones, which I think makes it kind of sit in a weird position.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and definitely at least the thing that it did for me is at least it made me read about it, because I knew from just what I learned in school, so it was pretty limited, and in a lot of ways, to your point, Deborah, it was pretty close to what we've been taught in school, like very high level, great men's and all this. So it's a bit super light, only scratching the surface and completely removing some of the complexity. So I didn't know much, but at least playing the game, I wanted to understand more, and it motivated me to read, for example, Philippe Contamine. That was super interesting for me. I discovered some really interesting aspects of it, and I started the David Green's book, so that was quite nice. And I was wondering what kind of books did you read while playing, and or did you read before that you feel are good illustrations of this, and what books did it motivate you to read, to turn it on the positive side? Maybe we can start with you, Pierre.
Sure. I have several books on the Hundred Years' War behind me. I'm trying to find some now. I think one by Max Gallo. But I didn't actually read any because of the game or as a follow up. I did go back to Men of Iron and their depictions of battles during the 100 Years' War, and I read up their notes just when sort of relevant characters came up and everything. That inspired me. But I think it is maybe a testament to the game that it didn't inspire me to go out and research more.
Yeah, that's actually a good thing. And you, Luis?
Yeah, absolutely none. I mean, just to be frank, because
Luis.
yeah. I mean, to my defense, I just started a new job with lots of reading, so it's yeah, but my bandwidth is very low right now. But it's just because, yeah, the game itself, I felt that it had more to do with popular perceptions of the time period than actual, than the actual the real history. And as Pierre just pointed out recently, like in our chat, 'cause the listeners aren't going to be able to see this. Is there's a lot of influence from Shakespeare, on this, and it's very, and that's very apparent. So if I would read something, maybe go back to Shakespeare, or actually, as Stuart was talking about, also go to some of the Japanese influences regarding a lot of the Japanese RPGs. Because I know there is one specifically that came out like 15 years ago, specifically called John of Arc, which is about, having John as like the main character. That's really interesting.
I think if that's the one I'm thinking of, Lahire is a lion man. It's wild. Bedford is possessed by the devil. What a game. What a game.
That would be a good topic for another discussion.
More accurate than the Warriors of God, right?
Yeah.
It's full anime. It's great.
And you, Deborah, did you had some readings on the side of playing the game, or?
I also started the David Green book. I haven't finished it yet. But I also resolved to read something about the Jacquerie, which I know very little about.
Christine Fernhaver Baker's book, Oxford University Press, came out in paperback on the Jacquerie. That's the book to read.
Fantastic, thank you.
And maybe just
it's called the Jacquerie. It's so good. It was like $100 when it was in hardback, and I couldn't recommend it to anyone. And now it's in a cheaper paperback. So good.
And maybe for context, Stuart, can you give us a quick 30-second recap of what the Jacquerie are for our listeners?
So the Jacquerie is a peasant revolt, mostly peasant revolt that happened in 1358, kind of in between the defeat of the French at Poitiers and the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. It happened in northern France, kind of north and northwest of Paris primarily, and sort of involved Paris itself. There's kind of a bit of a discussion around that, to the extent to which Paris is involved in kind of an urban revolt and also motivating this rural revolt. In many chroniclers of the time, like Froissart and other influential chronicles, it's described as this mass murder event where the peasants go around like rampaging and destroying everything in their wake. And then there's this thing called the counter-Jacquerie, where the nobles just indiscriminately murder peasants for about half a year. The whole revolt lasts less than a year, and the counter-Jacquerie lasts probably a little over half a year. So it's all pretty much wrapped up before 1360. One of the things I like about Fernhaber Baker's book is that she does a good job of kind of picking apart a lot of that story about how violent the Jacquerie is, and actually points out that quite a lot of it was more about property damage than actual murder. There's very few people murdered in the Jacquerie, and there's a few high-profile ones, but there's actually not as much mindless death as the chronicles lead you to believe. The counter-Jacquerie is horrifying.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a major peasant revolt, and one of the kind of first of the big ones in the Hundred Years' War. There's then in England one in 1381, and then there's in the 15th century several more.
And it's interesting because there was this leader, Etienne Marcel, that was from the bourgeoisie, and they had almost like a first Paris Commune at some point. So I thought that was quite interesting.
He has a distinctive hat as well. That's one of my favorite bits. There's these hats and hoods that they wore in Paris to distinguish themselves. It's really would work in like a modern kind of revolt where everyone wear red. We're on They're in the commune now, boys.
I think a good insurrection, that's something that got lost, but a good insurrection needs good hats. I think that's maybe one of the learnings that we got from the Jacquerie. That's definitely one thing. Good. So that's for the reading. And you were saying something interesting about the fact that there are not much 100 Years War games. And unfortunately, that's one of the only ones. I'm going to ask you, each of you, just if you could have like your ideal 100 Years War game, what would it be? What you would like it to show? And we can start with you, Deborah.
Oh goodness, I would
Yeah,
like.
so I have super hard question. I'm sorry.
Yes, I would like a little bit more about, well, a little bit less, if anything, of the sort of national things, a bit more about how nationalism grew as a result of this sort of conflict that's originally about just, people fighting over their inheritance and whether women really count as people, as the French said not, and so on. So, I would like a bit more economics and logistics of getting your armies in. But, well, I'd like a coin game, possibly. But yes.
Yeah, I think a gun game on the Jacquerie could be really awesome,
Yes.
but I think it would be hard to cover all of the 100 Years War. So what I'm hearing from you, because you're talking about logistics and specific revolts, do you think that covering the whole of the 100 Years War is a bit crazy, and maybe it should focus on specific episodes of the conflict?
Yes, maybe divided into two, because the Henrician invasion does feel quite different, I think, from Edward's. But yes, I don't know what Stuart would think about that.
Yeah, and you, Pierre, if you, what would be your ideal 100 Years War game?
Well, I think it's going to be coming out soon. It's Henry Levy
Oh
campaign.
Yeah, but that's only one small campaign. It's not that important of a campaign. Like, I don't like that campaign. It's a stupid campaign.
But I think it's Henry not because of the campaign. I think it's because it's that format, sort of looking at the operational side of it. It's more, in air quotes, realistic. It goes into more depth, and it's not trying to tackle the 100 Years War. I think that's, if you try and tackle the 100 Years War, you're just going to make another Warriors of God that just fails to sort of live up to what it could be, because it's 100 years. It's not.
And for the listeners and for context, the game you're referring to is Joe Schmidt's design that is in the Levian campaign series, currently on GMT's B500. So have you tried it already?
Yes. Yeah. I'm helping with the solo mode.
Okay, great. And you, Louis, what would be your ideal 100 Years War game?
Well, Henry's definitely up there. That's one of them. And I guess Deborah also described a lot of the things that I would like to see. Not necessarily the focus on the warfare, but more on the social, political, economic, and a lot of the actors that are not necessarily covered outside of academia. It's like, the peasants and that interaction. Like, let's say maybe a game that is more about one. Let's say with the English invade specific parts of what's now like modern day like France. Like, how do the peasants in the area feel about that? Like, and what's their agency, and what's how do they react about it? That's something regarding something interesting. Or maybe we can picture this, viewers, a game where you are living now and you're reading a book about the time period, and then you're like, all right, how can I make a game about this period? So it's a game about
making a game about the 100 Years War. That's super meta, Louis. I'm not sure that the listeners are ready for that, and for that level of that's going really deep.
If they listen to this podcast, they're ready for this.
Yeah, not yet, but soon we'll get them there. And it's interesting because a lot of you are mentioning peasant revolts and everything, and it reminded me of a book that I would recommend reading on it. That's super interesting, called Lust for Liberty. I think it's our Harvard University Press. It's one of the books that I use as a source for Jest of Robin Hood, that covers a lot of those peasant revolts and does a statistical analysis of them. It's super interesting. So if there is any interest in that, I think that, or at least I really enjoyed that book. But anyway, and you, Stuart, your ideal 100 Years War game, what would it be?
want so many 100 Years War games, though. All games should be 100 Years War games.
And
All
they
other
all
games should be cancelled.
yeah,
It
they
should be
sh- and
100
they
Years
sh-
War.
and they should all contain mostly crossbows, right?
Yeah, mostly
Yeah.
crossbows. A good crossbow ratio is essential to any good game. I would
Everyone
love to
gets a
see
crossbow.
Yeah.
a crossbow in the box. Like, let's
Yes.
just cut straight to it. Yeah, P500, game and crossbow. I think one thing that I would love to see more is something on a very grand level that really just looks at the kind of politics and economics of the conflict and captures how, I mean, we kind of tend to focus on this Anglo-French aspect. I think Deborah mentioned earlier, like there's this whole kind of greater geopolitical aspect of, you know, the Kingdom of Navarre getting involved, Burgundy's involved for stretches. There's this whole constant fighting over Brittany, which at the time isn't actually technically part of the Kingdom of France. So I'd love to see the captures more like that. Maybe, I mean, I haven't actually played this game because it's on my shelf of shame, but something more like Imperial Struggle that takes a much kind of further back political view of the conflict, I think would be really interesting to see an adaptation of the 100 Years' War in that vein that doesn't emphasize the campaigns and the battles and like the glorious English victories as much, and really kind of, I think one of the problems with a lot of those games is that they give you this, and a lot of English writing about it, is it gives you this impression that the English are winning, and then they don't win. And it's like, it's more than just battles, you know? You can win most of the battles and still lose in the end.
It's a really good point, I think, regarding the using a system like Imperial Struggle, because it's, yeah, once again, French against British on a very high level, but probably would, yeah, simplify the whole fighting process and focus more on the politics about it. And I think also we'll give a better depiction of a character like Charles V and how important it was for France in a lot of ways that it cannot be conveyed in a game like Warriors of God. So that's an interesting thought. Good, but maybe it's time to wrap up, and I would ask each of you to do a mini review. So overall, what did you like? Super quickly, a few bullet points, what you didn't like, and just a rating out of 10. Let's start with you, Pierre.
Yeah, I think overall, thumbs up. I liked it. I agree with everyone that the battles were too long. I agree that it's not a good representation of the 100 Years' War, but I think it's doing what it's trying to do, and it's doing that well. I think I'm going to play it again quite a bit, and I'd say a solid 7 out of 10 for me.
Okay, great. And you, Deborah?
I think I will go for a 6. I did enjoy it, but I also felt that by the end of my plays, I'd sort of seen the joke and I didn't need to hear it again. And I was tempted to go for 6.5, and then I reread the rule book, and it's a little bit about using masculine pronouns all throughout for the sake of consistency. And I thought, no, 6 will do.
Yeah. That's brutal but fair. I love it. Yeah, that's a really good review. Louis?
How do I follow that up?
That's hard.
Yeah, I would give it. You know, I was gonna give this a 9.5, but
Whoa, Louis, come on.
no. I mean, Deborah's been very eloquent about the criticisms, which, quite frankly, were things that I pushed to the side. So I'm gonna give this an 8, which for me it's a bad game. Not the favorite.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So
Then,
it's
yeah.
an 8. No, I mean, I enjoy just how it doesn't take itself too seriously, and if you're okay with that, it can be fairly enjoyable. I think it's actually, to a certain degree, a pretty good entry level war game at that. So that's something to keep in mind. Things that I didn't like about it: the length, obviously, and the randomness. Though it is a plus, sometimes it can go into a negative, especially if you're playing with another player who's not necessarily, along for the same ride as you are, right? So like they're just constantly keep getting those bad dice rolls. It can be a lot of, can be discouraging. And one thing too, I think the sequence of play is somewhat obtuse. I mean, the game overall is fairly simple, but when it comes to where you hire your troops and then you move them and then you set afterwards is when you set your leaders. There's something odd there that I still haven't been able to put my fingers on, but it's like I think there's a way that can be streamlined, and that would actually cut the length of the game by a lot too, because
Yeah.
that takes a lot of time there. Well,
And you,
Fabricant said I'm just gonna give it a 3, a 3 out of 10. 3 out of 10.
yeah, you're as swingy as the battles in this game, so that's only fair, I guess. And you, Stuart, what's your mini review?
So I really like Warriors of God. I mean, it's, as we've kind of all discussed, it's super random. I think the point is it's not a good model of the Hundred Years' War, but at the same time, I think if you took its core mechanics, this idea of these constant deaths of leaders, and you looked for a conflict to pick, like if you started mechanic first, the Hundred Years' War is a logical choice for it, in that sense that it's this big long war and a lot of people died suddenly. I think there's nothing else I played that's really like it, and for that reason, I really enjoy it. And I do enjoy, I enjoy the Hundred Years' War a lot, and it doesn't scratch the itch of a representation of it, but it is a theme I enjoy on an otherwise ridiculous game that I found very funny. It is too long. I agree with Louise. I find the kind of recruitment a little bit funny. Like when I'm playing on my own, I often just don't do that. I just place the leaders and then give them the right number of troops that like they could legally have, because it's just me and I'm like, let's just do this way. It's faster. I think I do the first 2 turns right and then I'm like, I'm done. But I love Warriors God. I will definitely keep playing it. It's such an interesting and weird little game. I would give it a 9 out of 10, but it doesn't have any crossbows in it. So the highest I can give it is a 4 out of 10. That's the rule. I don't make the rules. No crossbows, 4 out of 10. Flag over Paris, 4 out of 10. Just Robin Hood, looking dicey.
Yes,
so we'll see how it goes.
I'm gonna try to sneak in a few crossbows in there before the release. That's only fair.
You get a card that kills Richard the First with a crossbow. That's like, it's got to be in there.
Yeah,
that's how he died historically. It's how he should die in the game.
I'll do my best. And for my review, I think it's the merit that I see for it is that it manages to depict more than 100 years of conflict in a single session, which I think is quite impressive in terms of design. It has a lot of good ideas. I think I quite like the sequence of play. I think it's quite subtle in the way the things happen. Maybe the troop deployment is a bit annoying, but overall I think there is a lot of really good idea, and there is quite a lot of fun mechanics that I think is cool. But then I think the history is quite poor. It's a very narrow vision of the 100 Years' War that doesn't have much to tell. So I was really frustrated about this. The fact that it's random, I'm okay with, but the fact that it's a dice checker is, for me, it really got on my nerves quite fast. And on one hand, it was long, it was a bit boring on that aspect, and it didn't have a lot to say, so I was a bit frustrated. So in the end, I was more generous than Deborah, but I gave it 6.5. I'm happy that we played it. It has been on my shelf of shame for a long time, so I'm happy that it was picked up in the end. But it's I want another 100 Years War game in the end. That's maybe one of the thing. Maybe that's one of its merits. It's like when you play it, you want to design 100 Years War game, so that's better than this one.
It's the best intro game to the 100 Years War ever made.
Yeah, that's true. That's fair enough.
I do think one of the things we talked about earlier, but like if there was a scenario that was just like the second half of the war, the 15th century phase, I would play this game like twice as often. If there was just a 6-turn game, it's just you start in that. And I actually might spend a chunk of time coming up with an opening setup to play.
Let me know if you do.
I wouldn't mind so much better.
I wouldn't mind playtesting that with you, because I'm completely on the same page.
Yeah, I'm down too. But we have to also just add like some chits for crossbows. So
that can easily be added. I mean, that's. And Deborah, would you play a scenario that starts only at Joanna or Arc and contains crossbows? Or
yes, because I would quite like to get Joan of Arc doing her thing. So yes, no, I would have one more go.
We didn't talk about it actually, but I love Joan of Arc's rule. It's amazing. You basically have to roll if you fight her, and if you don't roll low enough, you don't get to act.
You're too scared, yeah.
Yeah, you're too scared of Joan of Arc. But then her bravery is terrible, so you almost never hits. That's definitely, I could see that dragging on way too long. But I do love that idea that's just like, yeah, Joan of Arc has shown up, you're too afraid to fight.
Yeah, that's
that can be easily fixed. Double crossbows for Joan of Arc. Two-handed crossbows.
But I think that's a good conclusion to that collective review of Warriors of God. And before we leave it to that, I will give back the mic to Louis to talk about the next game of the month for the Club de Jeu.
All right. So the next game, it looks like it's going to be Pax Porfidiana.
Come on, don't pretend like it looks like it's gonna be as if there is a democratic process behind it. Just live up to it, Louis.
No, there is a I've asked the question, how do people feel about it? It's Deborah raised the point about 2 weeks ago on the chat. The game got a lot of votes last month, and it just seemed almost like if we just did a vote again, right, that game was gonna just steamroll everything. I had to do quite a bit of persuasion to get Warriors of God to beat Pax Porfiriana, but I just asked the question, hey, if how do people feel about if we just nominate this, just have this game, and we had about 10 people that were okay with it. And I know Fred went back and also asked again to see if there's anyone that had any thoughts about that, and nobody nobody really said anything against the game. So
Yeah.
it looks like it. So the game is fun. It's really neat. Controversial designer, but the design itself though like stands for itself, and there's not many games. I don't think, actually, I don't know any game about that time period, right? You're talking about and it's actually something that I know quite a bit about too, so that'll be interesting to hear everybody's thoughts on.
Actually, there is another game about that time period, and it's by the same designer, and it's the game that inspired Pax Porfiriana. That is yeah. So
Lords of Sierra Madre.
Your Lords of Sierra Madre, exactly. Yeah,
Okay,
but we are going to be able to talk about this, I guess, next month. So next game of the month is Pax Porfiriana. So that's it for this month's Club de Jeu debrief on Warriors of God. I would like to thank all of you, Deborah, Stuart, Pierre, and Louis, for joining me for this session. It was extremely fun. And to the listeners, we'll see you next month to talk about Pax Porfiriana. Bye-bye.